Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. As we know, Americans head to the polls in less than 3 weeks. On November 8th, voters will elect a new House of Representatives, a third of the Senate, 36 governors, and they will fill a variety of other state offices. Against a backdrop of polarization unseen in generations, and with Democrats holding a razor-thin majority in both houses, the stakes are high for Democrats and Republicans alike. Historically, midterm elections are a referendum on the president and the party that he represents. Given Biden's unpopularity, only a few months ago, Republicans expected a wave election that would have brought them dozens of new House seats and a handful of pickups in the Senate. The Supreme Court's unpopular Dobbs decision on abortion rights, Biden's legislative accomplishments, and the poor showing of candidates endorsed by former President Donald Trump undercut Republican expectations. But in recent polls, support for Republicans is ticking up, largely due to concerns about the economy and inflation. The political mood in the United States in the run-up to the election is being followed closely in Europe. And I'm joined today by two of the keenest observers of the US political landscape. Both Annett Meiritz and Juliane Schäuble have been reporting from the US for about 5 years. Annett and Juliane, herzlich willkommen. It is wonderful to see you both. Annett is the US correspondent for the German business daily Handelsblatt, and Juliane is the US correspondent for the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel. They just published a new book on the female conservative movement in the United States, and we'll get into that a little bit later in our conversation. First, I'd like to talk to them about how they see the mood in the United States in the run-up to the midterms. Any observer knows that there are a number of make or break races which will decide which party controls the Senate, and one of the most competitive, but also one of the most closely watched races is in Pennsylvania, where the Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman, is up against Trump-backed Republican celebrity, Dr. Mehmet Oz. They're vying for an open seat that's being vacated by retiring GOP Senator Pat Toomey. Juliane, you were just in Pennsylvania, and I'd like to maybe start with you by hearing about what you saw and heard as you were out following candidates on the campaign trail.
I'm glad to do that. Thank you for having us, Steve. It's always a pleasure. It's true, I have been in Pennsylvania on Saturday. I'm not as often as the president in Pennsylvania. I think today it's his 16th time since he came into office, but it's so close to DC, so it's easy to cover. So I went to see John Fetterman, who, as you all know, had a stroke before the primaries. And I was interested in how he deals with that, how he can make his message. And I think he has an interesting way of using his weakness, his vulnerability to get to the voters. I mean, it was a democratic event, so most of the people, it was a pretty good turnout, a little bit more than 600 people in a very small town, Wallingford, close to Philadelphia, and they really say, we are here because we are afraid of threats to our democracy. We are here because we don't want this Trumpism in Washington. And they say they think he is fit for the job, and it's okay to be a little bit weak. But as we know, and they all admitted that the still high gas prices is an important issue, especially in a state like Pennsylvania, where you probably have to drive a lot. I don't have a car in DC, but I guess in Pennsylvania that's difficult. That's an issue they're concerned about, and I think crime is an issue that we probably haven't looked at, or the Democrats haven't spoken about enough. But of course, the other issues that motivate Democrats are threat to democracy, the ability of the president to govern the next 2 years, and of course, abortion, especially for women, was an important case everybody mentioned.
Thank you. So, Annett, let's bring you into the conversation. Obviously, you've been following from Washington what the key issues are on the agenda, and we've seen some fluctuation of that, as Juliane was just talking about. If I understand correctly, you were actually in the Howard Theater in Northwest Washington on Tuesday when President Biden spoke and talked a little bit about his plans moving forward. Can you talk a little bit about what the main issues are on the agenda for voters as you see it?
Well, first of all, I was trying to find out what the main issues for President Joe Biden are right now, because as a as a journalist, you have the feeling that he's trying to fight every battle right now, from economy, inflation, all the topics Juliane just said, abortion, student loans, you name it. But the problem is a little bit, of course, as a president, he has to do that. But on the other hand, people generally, when I as a journalist talk to them, don't necessarily know anymore what the Democrats stand for right now and what are they going to do when we actually have a split Congress or when we look ahead to the elections 2024. I mean, obviously, it's always a bit difficult to quote polls because polls can be wrong. But this particular poll from the New York Times this week that saw especially independent voters, especially independent female voters, going to the Republicans, that was interesting. And another thing I found even more interesting, that people don't care that much about the perils of the democracy right now, but they care even more about their daily cost, the high costs of gas, rents, and we know that, we feel that every day, we see that every day, and it reminded me a bit. Allow me this little look into history. I grew up in the former GDR, and people like more than 30 years later say, why didn't people in the GDR didn't rise earlier? Why didn't they went to the streets earlier? Why didn't they oppose the system? It's because people were caught in their all-day life. They were busy with living their lives, raising kids, buying groceries, and working. And the same thing you see here. When you talk to people, they are concerned about the democracy, but when they wake up in the morning, they want to have answers how they're going to figure out how to pay the next bill. And I'm not sure whether Joe Biden really finds the right tone right now when he says, when he's euphoric about the economy. Most people don't feel that euphoric feeling when they wake up in the morning right now.
I mean, I guess one of the questions for both of you is why Biden is not able to gain more traction. In his first 2 years, the Biden administration has had a couple of important legislative victories. I'm thinking specifically about the infrastructure bill, but also the technology bill, a veterans health bill, a gun safety bill. And most recently this week, it seems as if Biden has really been trying to increase awareness around what he's trying to do to alleviate some of the rising gas prices. Politico had a piece where they said, it's really all about the gas prices right now, and nothing else. And so I wonder, sort of, A, why Biden isn't gaining more traction, but B, whether it's more complicated than just the gas prices, or if both of you see it as really coming down to the day-to-day bread and butter issues that voters are trying to deal with.
I'm just jumping in here because obviously for me as a business correspondent, we have a strong focus on gas prices, and especially in Europe, they have a strong eye on the US developments as well, because when Joe Biden releases some oil reserves, for example, that might even have a positive effect on Europe. That on a side note. But the problem is a little bit, he did achieve many things, but I see the problem more of the expectations of Joe Biden. I saw it in Germany when Joe Biden was elected. Everyone was writing, a new era is going to begin. The US is going to change fundamentally, ignoring the realities with a Congress with a very narrow majorities and the very difficult circumstances he's facing. I think compared to the circumstances, he did pretty good. But I talked to a Democratic pollster and she said, it's his economy now. No matter that Trump messed up too before him, or he messed up with the COVID crisis, it's his economy now. And people don't care what was 2 years ago. So it's going to be a matter of trust on November 8th. And I'm not sure whether he still has that trust. But maybe, Juliane, you have a more positive outlook on that.
It's not easy when we have seen what can happen. But I think one thing is true, it's expectation management. And I think the expectations were huge. That, by the way, is also interesting for Kamala Harris, the vice president, who many people expected amazing things as a vice president, not really looking and understanding what a vice president actually is there for and can do. It's also, I think, a messaging problem of this government. I think it's often said, but there is something to it. And if you look at the argumentation for the inflation, they didn't want to admit it for a long time. Now we have the same debate about is this country in a recession? Is it not? And I understand that you don't want to talk bad about, make it worse than it actually is, but you have to admit that there is a problem. It's funny because gas prices really went down. I don't drive much, but I sometimes rent a car, and I paid like $3.30 a gallon in Pennsylvania. So that is actually cheaper, but I think the overall trust in these questions is bigger on the Republican side. You don't know. I mean, it always depends also on the candidates that are there, and that's in Pennsylvania and in Georgia. It's different than in other states. But I think the overall question is: who do you trust? Who concentrates on the most important issues more and doesn't get sidetracked by other things? And Biden, and sorry, one more point. Biden does a lot of things at the same time, as Annett said. When you think about the student loans, that's an issue this progressive part of his party wants so much, and it's very important. On the other hand, people are afraid that this brings up inflation again. So you're dealing with a lot of and a big party. It's a very, very big party, the Democratic Party.
And yet, despite this, Biden has sort of been conspicuous through his absence when it comes to midterm campaign rallies, right? He hasn't had a single one since Labor Day. Juliane, you noted he's been spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania. He'll be in Pittsburgh today and in Philadelphia, doing two events. But those events are also not necessarily going to be sort of high visibility events, from what I understand. And this absence probably reflects his low approval rating. But it's interesting to note that Obama had a similar approval rating in October of 2010 at about 44%, and he held 16 campaign rallies in October. Even though he was kind of in the same boat as Joe Biden is right now. Do either of you have sort of an explanation as to why he is not being more active? Is it partly because some of the candidates don't really want him to be because they see him as a liability? Or what's your assessment of Biden's role in the midterms right now?
I think that's a big part. I think not in every state they are asking for him to show up and hold a rally. And as we know, Obama is a much better motivator and speaker. And he is actually going to have 4 rallies in 4 important states. And we hope that we can cover him in most of these rallies, because it is interesting to see how he talks and what he by the way, said that the Democrats should be more like John Fetterman. So that's kind of a candidate that really attracts a lot of attention. I think we also should not forget it is an extraordinary situation with the war in Ukraine and still COVID. It is nothing as it has been before. I would say. I think the sheer size of these crises and how long they last and how much they affect, it is different than in any races before. So maybe he is a little bit more distracted with too many other things than just going on the campaign trail.
Annett, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just thought what I found as a foreign journalist most interesting about this election is like this kind of a split screen, not necessarily between Democrats and Republicans. We already know that from the 2016 elections, but this, like, on the one hand, like the same pollster I talked to said to me, you know, people are just fed up. We had the financial crash 2008. We had COVID lockdowns, pandemic, Ukraine war, energy crisis now. So people are just have the feeling it's not getting better. It's just getting worse for 15, 20 years now, not to forget 9/11. So the series of really bad happenings is never going to end. On the other hand, you have this huge motivation, not just by young people, the grassroots movements, where actually Germany and European countries could learn a lot about mobilization and motivation and democracy. People just go out and are passionate about topics. And in Germany, you have to call someone for 3 times to ask him or her to help with an election campaign. So I see this deeply polarized country, but on the other hand, you still have very, very lively, passionate voters, grassroots movements who keep this whole stuff going and who keep an eye on the democracy. And I think that's actually beautiful in all that negative headlines we're all facing day by day. So we shouldn't forget about that part.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little bit about the race in Pennsylvania. Obviously, there are a number of other important races, a number of swing states that we're looking at, particularly when it comes to the Senate races, but also in thinking about governors' races. You know, on that list for me are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin. I'd like to invite each of you to tell us a little bit about which races you're particularly interested in and what you're watching for.
I think Georgia is it's called the ground zero of the big lie of the whole debate on who gets to vote and how difficult should it be, or controlled or how safe it should be. I think it is incredible. As I just looked at the polls before we started talking, it looks like there is, like, Raphael Warnock is profiting from the bad stories on his opponent. But not as much as you would probably think. Somebody who has been lying about his many children he has, about so many aspects in his life, and he's still not really having a big losses, because apparently the saying is true that the polarization is so strong, the blocks are so strong that you can nominate anybody, you still vote for your party. And as we have seen in the January 6 hearings, many of these Republicans who said they are critical against Trump, they still would say, or they're critical of his actions after January 6, would still vote for him if he would be on the ticket. And that you can see in Georgia. So I really see that there's something really interesting going on. And you also have this amazingly interesting governor race, when you have the acting governor, Brian Kemp, who was crucial in saving the democracy, maybe, who is a Republican and who is leading against Stacey Abrams, who tries to make the voting laws better, who tries to engage people and bring them to the polls. But she doesn't profit from that herself. It's probably going to lose again. So. But if there's a late shift in the next week, that would be really interesting. And Obama is going there on the 28th. So yeah, an interesting race to see.
I will definitely have an eye on South Texas, not necessarily because it's going to be important for the majorities of the Congress, but because we will see whether this trend of within the Latino, Hispanic population, that more people may be voting for the Republicans. There are many female, very radical, very Republican candidates there in South Texas. I think that's highly interesting because it's only a small part of the US, but it says so much about how the demographics are changing, maybe. Arizona, I would love to go there because it's warm. No, but also...
Well, there's an interesting governor's race going on there as well.
Yes, that's the main reason. And Phoenix has the highest inflation in the whole US. So it's actually interesting to see how all those booming cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, maybe even Miami. A year ago, we all wrote about how those cities, how people from LA and the Silicon Valley and New York are moving there. Maybe the inflation will going to stop that trend. So this is something I have an eye on. But election-wise, Arizona, Georgia, obviously, what Juliane said, and South Texas are probably Nevada, Ohio. So there are many races we have to watch. Yes.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot to cover, particularly since there are a number of seats that look likely to flip, or where there is an incumbent or a candidate that has stepped down, and where we have new candidates on both sides. I'm thinking particularly about Ohio, where Senator Rob Portman is freeing up a seat, and there's a hot race between Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance, who a lot of people know because of his Hillbilly Elegy book. And of course, Ohio is one of those swing states as well, where we just don't know, which way it's going to go.
No, it's true. And I think the Democratic candidate just complained that there's not enough attention on his race, and it is true. It's that for that it's really astonishing that Washington does not make more campaigning, does not go out and really try to get these races. I don't really have the answer. As longer I think about it, I think maybe they should try to go every day and everywhere. But on the other hand, he also tries to send out the message that he's taking care of inflation, of Ukraine, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, Annett, you took your microphone off mute. Did you want to add something to that?
No, because everything Juliane says is
okay. But Annett, let me come back to something else that you said. You mentioned the New York Times Siena College survey that indicates that undecided voters seem to be trending toward Republicans, and that your sense was that people don't know exactly what the Democrats stand for, and that is likely to be an issue in the midterms, but it's also likely to be an issue in the election in 2024. I guess I have two questions for you both. One is why do you think people don't really understand what the Democrats stand for? And the other is, have the Democrats recognized that this is a challenge that they face? And what are they doing to try to sort of establish a stronger profile or make clear what it is that they stand for?
I just think they changed their message too often. First, like very early in the presidential campaign, none of the Democrats wanted to say the name Trump. No one said it because they just didn't want to talk about him. Then everything was about this, the soul of the nation. And then at the Virginia race, it was all about Trump. Like Biden was campaigning, and it was all about us against Trump, the soul of the nation against Trump. Then we had this saying goodbye to the trickle-down economy, being, higher taxes and making life for the middle class and disadvantaged people better. He wanted to be the climate president next. Then the White House reacted far too late on the whole inflation issue, as we all know. It just was a messaging problem from the very beginning, where I remember that TV stations like Fox News, they covered it spot on from day one. They and the White House was like 3 months later. So there's kind of a tone deafness, I think. So I think it's just such a mixed message overall, that I think that's a problem. On the other hand, the Republicans change their message too all the time, so I'm not even sure whether both.
What is the message? I would ask. What is the message of the Republican Party?
That's a good question, Juliane. So, but that's I think that's the main problem.
So, I'd like to maybe switch gears a little bit, because I can't really remember a time when I noticed as many women running for office in a midterm, and particularly Republican women, as is the case this year. And I want to use that as sort of building a bridge to the book that you recently published, which was released in Germany. The English title of it would be Guns n' Rosé: The Rise of Conservative Women in the United States. And Juliane is holding up a copy of the book. In this book, you explore how female conservative movement in the United States is really shaping politics and society here. First off, congratulations on the book. I know that both of you spent a lot of time and energy working on it, and that has paid off because it has been named among the top 10 recommended books by Die Zeit, ZDF, and Deutschlandfunk. So congratulations on that. And I guess I'd like to sort of start by asking, what was the catalyst for you to write this book? I mean, both of you had been out and about in the US and sort of measuring the pulse of what was going on outside of the Washington bubble. But was there something in particular that sort of set you off to say this story needs to be uncovered? We want to shed some light on this.
Annett, you want to start?
Oh, you yeah, just quickly, that's not my strength, but I will try. So first of all, we all remember the women's marches, and that's the time where Juliane and me just moved to the US, or a little bit later. And we all remember those pictures of millions of women all over the country marching against Donald Trump. And my first question back then was, what about the other women? What about people who will not march against Donald Trump? And we always had this in Europe and Germany and in parts of the US, this not believing, why can Latinas, women, African Americans, why can groups like this vote for a man like Donald Trump? And instead of bathing in that rage, we thought, we want to explain it. We want to understand it. We want to have answers. And it's not enough to just be irritated about it or shocked. That's just not our job. And then Juliane and me had a lot of very passionate debates about Hillary Clinton and about Kamala Harris, and whether there are any Republican women on the other side, and how do they campaign, and what do they want. And that was the main idea. Did I forget anything?
No, and then I think we talked a lot about the squad and about this, female bonds in Congress that are all liberal, and because of course feminism is connected to the liberal side of the political spectrum. But when you go to the Republican events, and when you see Kristi Noem or Nikki Haley or all these people, you realize, well, they also talk about feminism. Or even the people protesting against abortion in front of the Supreme Court, these kids, this college students, they say, we are feminists, we are here to be there for women. So we can, as liberals, as we probably are as journalists, can say, but that's not right. But we cannot tell them not to say it. We have to understand what they mean, and that's what also triggering. And for example, many of them, Kristi Noem said, I grew up on a ranch. My dad did not make a difference if I'm a boy or a girl. We had to get up in the morning and work. And that's what was expected. I did not have to fight for my place in society. But he also says it would be good if women would be at the table wherever decisions are made. So they're also going for the interest of women. And when you look at for example, the elections in Italy, the same argument started after the decision, that how can this be? How can Italians vote for a woman that is bad for women interests? But she is the first female president, prime minister. So there's still this not trying to understand what is actually happening. There are women who want to be conservative.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what this conservative feminism looks like, or how it's defined?
One very interesting example is obviously abortion debate, but there are other very non-obvious examples as well where you wouldn't expect it. But in the abortion debate, I found it very interesting. Without women in the US, the abortion right would have never been ended by the Supreme Court, because all the big anti-abortion organizations, they've been working for 50 years to remove Roe versus Wade, and they are all led by women. So it's not necessarily a war from men against female bodies. It's more a war of very conservative, very privileged women against other women. So this is a thing. This is a very interesting thing, I would say. So this is one area where they have a huge influence. And another not so obvious area is education. I mean, in Europe, we wrote a lot about book bannings, like books that are banned from curriculums at school. And that's not necessarily a female thing, but I mean, of course, the education of children is still in the hands of mostly women in the US and in Europe as well. And it's not so much a question of being conservative or not, but they said the state cannot dictate what our children are reading. It's more a question of freedom, non-freedom, how you define freedom. So those are the questions we are describing in our book, and also how women shape fear in crime and economy, and what in the end does feminism means today, when part of the women say, well, you don't mean us when you say feminist. We are different than you. So, but Juliane, maybe you can add something to that. So that
well, maybe as a follow-up though, and Juliane, maybe this is something you can pick up on. I'm curious to know sort of what role religion might play, what role the right to bear arms might play in this sort of notion of conservative feminism.
A big role, not for everybody, but I think especially in the abortion question, they argue with life, and God can only give life and take life, except when it comes to the death penalty, but that's another issue. That's, by the way, always an interesting debate when you have it with these anti-abortion advocates. That is... I'm Catholic, so I know the debate in Europe and in our church. That is something that is of big influence, and it has become stronger in the argumentation. The right to bear arms. It's interesting that women, because many of them say in these insecure times and in the pandemic, we also want to be able to defend ourselves. We don't have men, or we don't want to have men to only do that for us. We want to do it for ourselves. So it's also for them a signal to I'm equally strong as the men. So it's that you can also say is kind of a conservative feminism. I can shoot myself. I can, or Afro-American conservatives, female conservatives, who are not the majority, of course. But when you talk to them, one red line that goes through the discussions is, yes, there is racism, but could we please not only talk about racism? Could we also look into the future? Could we say, where are my chances? And maybe because I went through that, I'm tougher, I'm stronger, and I want to have my place at the table. If I'm Black or if I'm not Black, it shouldn't be the criterion to get into anywhere. It's at least a debate you have to have. Yeah? And sometimes you are surprised by the answers you get.
Yeah. And just to add one more thing, I mean, guns is super important and all the other stuff, but just coming back to the education thing, because I know that many people in Germany and in the US during the pandemic, the whole school education issue was just such an important issue for so many people, because they felt left alone by the government, whoever that is. And it kind of, I mean, and I think conservative, they do have a point when they say curriculums have been intransparent and parents were left alone. And so I think it's important to understand where they come from, instead to just be shocked when another book is banned. It's just not that easy. So that's what we were trying to describe in our book, without defending radicalism and extremism, of course. I mean, Kari Lake in Arizona, the candidate, she is so radical, she is so extremist, she's very smart. But on the other hand, you have to name what she is. She is an anti-democratic candidate who doesn't believe in democratic structures, and that you can describe without having, without being without being irritated by it, just describing it.
Right. I mean, Kari Lake is sort of an interesting person to follow. She's very charismatic, but she's also been very outspoken about the 2020 election being stolen. And so it's kind of interesting to see what sort of a following she is having. I would like to pick up a couple of threads that you both have just talked about, and maybe let's start with that education piece, because you were talking about it, Annett. And it's interesting, in your book you dedicate 2 chapters to really talking about this education piece. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about why you see this as being an important role for mobilizing particularly conservative women, right? I mean, I tend to think about education as something that parents are involved with, so right, fathers and mothers. But of course, there might be more women who are involved with doing homework with their kids than the fathers are. But can you talk a little bit about a little bit more about how much of a role education plays?
Annett, what do you want?
Yeah, just quickly. I think it plays a huge role because that topic doesn't only appeal to conservatives, but also to independents and even Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to one mom in New York, and this is obviously a very difficult topic because we all want to be open, tolerant, and not discriminating. But the whole transgender education debate in schools, and Democrats don't talk about it, is for many parents who are not even conservative a concern. This mom said to me, well, my son is 10 years old and he doesn't even have sexual education yet, but he already was invited to 4 workshops on gender identity. I would like them to teach him first, how does your body work? How does sexuality work? How does your body functions? He didn't even learn that in school yet, and they already invite him to 4 transgender workshops. Why is that? And you can say now, wow, that is so intolerant, and how can she question that? But I think I think in some schools it might just go too far, and that parents are irritated by it and they have questions, and it's not allowed to ask questions in some areas and regions. And I think it's a very hot topic, and many Democrats don't want to talk about it because they don't want to get into that hot topic, and conservatives just jump right in, and they jump right in on a very radical and intolerant way very, very often. But you have to give them credit that they kind of read the room,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak.
And I think that maybe that's an important issue when you don't want to talk about things, then somebody can fill that gap.
Yes.
And that's what both sides of a political spectrum should be more anyway. But if it's only 2, that is not good. If you leave it open, if you don't, it's look at the immigration numbers right now. If you don't want to talk about it, if you avoid speaking of anything that might be concerning, then people will say, wait a minute, that's not true. The other side is talking about it, and it's of course talking about it in many ways on media that is dangerous. But the answer would be, well, look at the issues, talk about the issues that people are concerned with, and if you don't have a language, try to find a language. Try to find a way to talk about it in a better way.
So that's actually a good segue in a sense to bring in this topic of race and ethnicity as well. Annett was talking earlier about watching what's going on in South Texas. In your book, you have a chapter on the Hispanic vote. I think it's fair to say that the conservative movement, particularly among women in the U.S., is majority white, but there are, of course, some examples of prominent African-American women, Latinas, Asian Americans, who are hardcore Republicans and who have broader representation. And I guess, one of the questions for you is are these individuals sort of more of an exception to the rule, or do you see a bigger trend? Do you see the Republicans, and particularly conservative Republican women, appealing to a wider base, if you will?
Well, number-wise, of course, as Juliane mentioned before, they are not in a majority at all, yes, but they are very loud and they have a huge influence. For example, I think in Texas alone, there are 3 female Latina candidates on the Republican ticket. And I think what is most interesting, I tried to find moderate Republican female candidates. I didn't find them. So if you are a new female Republican candidate right now, you are most of the time far right, radical, extreme. I tried to find out why that is. I talked to one professor, he said, who's dealing for a long time with that issue and wrote several books about it. And he said, well, as a woman in the political field, usually you get less money from donors. You have to be louder, you have to be more aggressive, you have to be more radical to be seen and to be heard. And so it's, as a woman, being moderate in a political field is not a great idea. So this is very interesting. I see that the more females are on the conservative side, like in very powerful positions, the more radical maybe the Republicans get. And it's not necessarily because of the Trumps of the world. It's also because of this new generation and maybe the new gender role that and on another note, the Republicans know exactly that they cannot politically survive without female voters, without more diverse voters, without the Latinas, with African-American voters. They cannot, they need at least a small piece to get majorities.
Yeah, and the blocks are so close together that even little shifts can make a huge difference. So if there's, I mean, the Latino vote is really, really interesting. And if there's even a slight shift, that then the Democrats are in trouble, at least for the next elections, because for a while it was kind of automatic that this vote, an increase of the Hispanic population, would help the Democrats. But it is not like this. If I think if you come from a country, especially when you come from a country when you flee socialism or communism or whatever, or how they define it, then you want a more business-orientated policy. Again, you want to have the ability to make your own business, to, in the pandemic, for example, to be able to try it, to be brave and not to be restricted again by a government that they feel mingles too much with their own lives. So that is a big question and a very interesting debate to look on for the next years.
So when thinking about some of these cleavages, I'm curious whether you also saw sort of an urban-rural divide. Juliane, I think it was a little earlier that you were mentioning Kristi Noem, the governor from South Dakota, right, very rural. Did you, in your work on the book, see any splits between cities and more rural areas?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think college cities, college towns, we always have it in all these, Wisconsin and in these states. The cities are more liberal, the countryside is more conservative. There are other debates important when you live in rural Wisconsin than it probably is when you live in New York. It's the question of gas. It is in the pandemic, how community sticks together. How do you make it work? You don't want to probably talk too much about the history and the mistakes that were made in history, but about the actual problems you have day to day. It's not always fair, but it's but I think it is true. And of course, religion is also, I think, as we know, much stronger on the countryside, and the role church plays in the community. And in the pandemic, we heard that was a kind of meeting place and connections that held these communities together. And then they shut down churches, which I understood at the heights of the pandemic, but that was of course an issue where conservatives or very strong believers of people who go to church every Sunday, who have their friends there, who I was a high school student in Texas in 1992 in a family that was First Baptist. So I know how important, what important role church plays. And when you tell these people you cannot go to church for like a year to your community, you wonder why people get angry. I don't know, maybe find another way of doing it. And they did it on their own ways. They find ways to get around and to meet outside or all these things. And I think a little bit more understanding what people are motivated by would also help.
In terms of this kind of motivation, I'm curious whether you think that the election of Donald Trump actually served as a catalyst for this conservative women's movement that we're seeing unfold, and if you can talk a little bit about the relationship that some of the people in this group that you've identified have with the former president.
I think it started earlier. Like one chapter in our book kind of describes that conservative women have played a huge role for almost 100 years in the US, and
but not
certainly
been quite as visible.
Yes, visible.
Right.
And then within the Tea Party movement, that was very, very interesting, because women started to evolve from this whole, parenting, staying at home issue and how to preserve traditionalist values They kind of evolved to a more economy focus. How will I feed my family? And they had careers. They were very social media savvy. So they were very modern. And that was kind of, I mean, that's 12 years ago, but that was kind of the root for the conservative female movement now, who is even more, as Juliane described, well, we don't need necessarily a man in a high politics position. I want to have that position. So I don't need someone to support. I want to be the one who's making the decisions here. So this is very interesting. And when it comes about Trump, of course, he was a catalyst. We saw in the election 2020 that more women voted for Trump than 2016. And back then in 2016, we were like, oh, maybe we don't know enough about Donald Trump. Maybe he's less radical when he's a president. And all these women saw who he is within those 4 years in the White House, and they voted for him anyway, and in even higher numbers. And that is, I think, the main question we want to raise in our book. It's not just a book about women or the female movement. It's the question about what you think it's going to happen, and maybe it won't happen, because you have to think differently about things and why people vote for certain politicians. And coming to your last question, and then I will stop. They necessarily, like many of the women we talk to, they don't see an alternative to Trump. Obviously, he's still the most powerful donor raiser. He's the most powerful politician still within the Republican Party, or retired politician so far. And they know that it's not possible to get majorities without his support. They just know, they're pragmatic.
And of course, you have some who kind of love him, like it's in a cult. We know that in the MAGA world. But you also have people who are pragmatic, and you say, I'm not a really big fan of him, but that's not the only decision I'm making about the person. It's also about the politics he stands for. And maybe conservatives are sometimes a little more pragmatic in their voting decision than Democrats, who are very good in criticizing their own president, by the way. And that's maybe also an explanation for Biden's not so good polls, because his own party is not always praising what he's doing. And so maybe it's easier to be a Republican politician than a Democratic politician. Your base is probably more sticking to you.
I mean, thinking about these challenges at the moment, if you will, and bringing it back to the midterms, I'm curious about your thoughts about what voter participation might be like in the midterms. In my mind, I think that's going to be key for both sides. I mean, as we said at the outset, there's a lot at stake for the Democrats. There's a lot at stake for the Republicans. It was interesting to read early this morning that in Georgia, early voting is exceeding presidential early voting. So it's record-setting in terms of the number of people that are submitting ballots early. What's your sense of what voter participation might be like, and who do you think stands to benefit?
It's very early, but I think some debates motivated both sides, like the abortion debate, of course, motivated conservatives, but also the anger, the fuel. I'm not sure how it is when you live in a state that has no influence on the decision that are going to be made in Washington, D.C., because it's already clear that it's only important what happens in Nevada, in Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and so on. And the more we concentrate, and that's a problem for us too, as reporters who cannot write 10 stories a day and print them in a newspaper, we kind of neglect the rest of the country by looking. I mean, Pennsylvania, how often can you be to Pennsylvania? The president 16 times. Yeah? You would wish he could have the time and energy to go somewhere else. So I don't know how it is in these states, and I'm afraid there the mobilization is not as big.
Well, I was just thinking about your question, who's going to benefit? I really have to pass on that because I don't know, and I think that's going to be the main question we should look on election night. Another thing I found interesting, though, when in terms of mobilization and motivation, we saw that during the abortion protests. I Biden is standing there in front of his base and is saying, well, the Republicans, they're going to see the rage of people. When I go somewhere, outside of the Washington bubble, I don't really see that rage. I don't really feel that rage. You see it in Georgia, of course, Stacey Abrams. Like there are some like Democratic figures who really are passionate, and they are idols, and people follow them, and then you see like they're getting huge crowds when they go somewhere, but there are not that many. And I'm not sure with which topic, climate or saving the soul of the nation, what kind of topic is it that the Democrats are going to motivate and mobilize with? Abortion, I'm not so sure about when we see the inflation numbers and all that. But yeah, I think I sometimes think the Democrats or the Democrat base, they need to relearn how to fight for something.
Mm-hmm. So looking to the future, I mean, obviously a lot can happen in the next 3 weeks. There are lots of races to watch. I think voter turnout, voter participation will be a key factor. And we've seen, even an ebb and flow in that over the last 4 months in terms of what the prognosis was. But looking ahead to 2024, and I know that is a political eternity when thinking about the presidential election. Any thoughts on how what we've talked about today, how the midterms, how this feminist conservative movement might sort of impact the race? Juliane, you already talked about Italy and the fact that it's surprising for some that such a conservative woman was elected the first prime minister of Italy. There are obviously some candidates on the Republican side who might be contenders. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what you see, how you see this unfolding?
One point I would make is we have to wait until the midterms, because both like Biden and Trump have kind of hinted that the decision is not going to be made before. There are several things. I think for Trump, there's a lot of legal issues he's thinking about. If this kind of gives him a political immunity, he's surely going to go for it. Biden turns 80, so the big question, of course, how old should you be to be the president of the most powerful country on earth? And as long as these two figures have not decided, I think it's very hard to. I've read lots of portraits on Ron DeSantis, and that is almost clear that he's going to be the next strong man. As long as these two men are still there, it's very early. I think what we can say is there are at least for the middle time future, there are very interesting women on the Republican side to watch. And I think the Democrats are still kind of shocked that Hillary Clinton could have lost. So there might be caution to present the next woman running for the White House. So that's what we kind of said without knowing how anything is going to be in 6 years or whatever. But the first female president could very well be Republican, because it's not such a big issue if you are a woman or a man. It's more. They just take it as it is. And they say, we don't need a quota to come into the White House. We do it because we are better than the others.
Yeah. Annett, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that was beautiful. So it's hard to.
Okay.
Or at least we will see a female vice president first, a female Republican vice president. This is probably 2024. That it's a very realistic scenario, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So I guess as we come to a close, do either of you have any final thoughts for us about things that you think our viewers should be watching in the days and weeks ahead, or topics that we've not touched on yet today that you want to at least mention briefly?
I would just say take a closer look on election eve on those, and not just majorities in Congress, but actually who voted where, because of what issues. Because when we analyze that more, we know more about 2024. And I think there will be a few surprises, and the narrative that certain voting groups are certainly going to vote Democratic, it might be proven wrong.
And I think it's going to be interesting where Biden is going to going to show up in the next 3 weeks, where it's really, where they really think it's going to be closed, and then at the end, were they right, or did they totally not see one big blinking light that said, come and help? And I heard about California. There are some doubts that everything is so clear. California, it's very expensive to live. I was there for our book for 4 weeks. So I think there are some issues if you live there that make you vote Republican, even if you don't like Trump, and that can just seriously be the cost of living. That is crazy. I would not like to have to earn that money. That is not easy to survive there.
And maybe, you know, a closing question to both of you. At the outset, I said that this election, the midterm, is being followed very closely by people in Europe, particularly by people in Germany, as sort of conduits to Germans, to Europeans. What are you finding that your readers are interested in hearing about when it comes to the midterm election?
My readers right now, they read all about the energy crisis, of course, and the Ukraine. Like, the one big question that was raised, what is going to happen with the Ukraine fundings from the US for the Europeans when the GOP is retaking the House? This is a real concern, like the money for Ukraine help, financial Ukraine help, which might end if the GOP is retaking the House. This is very important. And the protectionism of Joe Biden, especially for my readers, investors, companies, green energy, will they get a piece of the cake? That is important for them.
And we have to say that it's still a lot of Trump reporting. It's still a lot of, is this coming back? Because people still don't really understand it. They don't associate it enough with the picture they have of this country. So they want to know is he finally, is a judge, is a court, is something of one of these many legal problems leading anywhere? Is this just, this whole reporting, this whole attention on him, is this in vain because he just walks away anyway? So that is not always the nicest thing to hear, that the interest is still huge, but I guess it's understandable. And of course, the threats to democracy are real, and we have some similar debates in Europe. And we in Germany always say everything that starts here sometimes comes across the Atlantic, good and bad. And so some developments, the election doubts, the threats to democracy, populism on the rise, probably more on the right side, but also on the left side, is something that concerns people, and they want to read about it. They are also interesting on anything new we can tell them about, new candidates coming up. A new race would be interesting for 2024.
Well, Juliane and Annett, I want to thank you so much for your reporting. I want to congratulate you again on your book. As I heard one of you say yesterday, some people are saying this absolutely needs to be translated into English and made available to American readers as well. But for those of you that read German, I can recommend that you read Guns and Rosé. But a huge thanks to both of you for taking the time to talk with us and give us your sense of what's going on here in the US, and sharing your perspective as foreign correspondents. Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you so
for
much.
hosting us.